welcome to another episode of the program, Message of Grace. My name is Hussein. I'm very happy to be with you today, happy that you can be with me. And before we start the program, let's just pray. Heavenly Father, we just thank you for your wonderful love, Father, for all people. Thank you that you sent Jesus to die for all people, Lord. And we just pray that, Lord, you would just bless us today, Lord. Anoint our words, anoint our hearts, Father, and our lips, Lord, to speak your words, Lord God, with your anointing, with your power to accomplish your purpose, to touch hearts. And Lord, let the people who need to watch the program today, let them be watching, Lord. And Lord, bless our guest, Mr. Ibrahim, and thank you, Father, for being with us. Thank you for your love. Amen. One thing that I've been doing quite a bit recently on the program is that I've been taking a lot of Father Zechariah's old programs, and I've been translating them into English, and then I present them here on this program, because I'm just beginning to feel the urgency that the lessons and the things that Father Zechariah has been teaching over the last 15, 16 years, that it's so important that the West discover these things, that the West understand these things, because it has caused an earthquake in the Middle East, has caused literally an earthquake in the whole entire Muslim world, the things that Father Zechariah has revealed about Islam, and about jihad, and about Muhammad. And it's been so impactful in the Middle East and in the Muslim world, that I feel it's so important that the West also discover, because the West now is confronting Islam, and it's doing it very blindly, as it really doesn't know what it's up against. But there has been an author who, his name is Raymond Ibrahim. He's of Egyptian heritage, but he was born and raised in the United States. And he has been very instrumental. He has written several very poignant articles about Father Zechariah, especially. This is how I got to know him. He had written some articles about Father Zechariah, describing some of the impact of Father Zechariah's teachings in the Middle East to the West. So he's actually helping to educate the West about the impact of Islam, the dangers of jihad, the reality of jihad. And well, another thing that is happening that we're very fortunate to be able to have him with us on our program today is that he has written, this is one of his books, it's called Crucified Again. And tomorrow he is actually putting out another book. I believe we have the picture. It's called Sword and Scimitar. This is about the relationship between Islam and the West, going back to some of the most famous battles in the history of the West and the Muslim world. Just a fascinating look at these different battles. And so we have him with us today. And so, hello, Mr. Ibrahim. Are you with us here?
Oh, hello,
okay.
Yes, hi.
It's great to see you, and it's great to have you on the program today. You know, like I said, the way I got to know you and became interested in speaking with you was because of the articles you had written about Father Zechariah. One of them was called The Perverse Sexual Habits of the Prophet, and you had written that for a pretty well-known publication regarding Muhammad, what Father Zechariah had said about Muhammad and his teachings. And so it was through that, step by step, I kind of came to understand that you've actually done a phenomenal amount of work. You've been involved with the Middle East think tank in Washington, D.C. Is that right?
Yeah, I've been with several. There's the Middle East Forum in Philadelphia. Middle East Forum. I was at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. I was at the Hoover Institution in California for a little while.
Wow.
So,
wow, that's very impressive credentials that you have, and I suppose I want to first of all just ask you a little bit about how did you first of all get interested in doing this? I mean, I know that your parents are from Egypt originally, but you were born in the West. What kind of alerted you to the need to do what you are doing right now?
Well, from an academic standpoint, I've always been most interested in history, especially ancient into the medieval era. Anything before the modern era has always interested me, and that's what I studied in college.
Okay.
And then I, naturally gravitated to that nexus of history that most interested and applied to me on a personal level, and my heritage coming from the Middle East and Egypt, but also being raised in the West. I naturally found an interest in the clash between Islam and the West. And so in college, for instance, my master's thesis was about one of the battles that's in my book that's coming out tomorrow. And so it shows you how I've been doing this actually for almost 20 years. But so, along with the academic professional interest in the Middle East and Islam and its relationship to the West, and naturally, probably like you and so many of the viewers, I have my own personal background and heritage coming from Egypt, knowing the language, knowing the culture. And so it's always, of course, of interest to be able to tie in current events or history to one's own personal background. And then, in fact, right when I was writing that thesis I was telling you about, 9/11, the strikes of 9/11, 2001 happened. And so that really
it happened, 9/11 happened while you were working on your thesis?
Correct.
Wow.
And so it was enough time for me to put a concluding chapter, which actually tied up, things like Osama bin Laden's worldview with Khalid bin al-Walid, Saif Allah, the sword of Allah's worldview, and how very similar the two were intentionally, from Osama at least. So that's how I, naturally gravitated into all this. And make a long story short, after I got my master's degree in history, I went to the East Coast, and I went to Georgetown University, also a master program, and later I was involved with a history program. I also went to Catholic University while I was in Washington, D.C., but I got a job at the Library of Congress in the Middle Eastern Division, and I worked there for almost 7 years, and it became too hard to do all of that at once, as well as write my first book, The Al-Qaeda Reader, which was based on Arabic writings from Osama bin Laden and Ayman Zawahiri that were sent to the Library of Congress years before 9/11 happened, and that were never translated or disseminated. And I came across them while I worked there, and so I translated them and juxtaposed them next to the propaganda messages that they sent, which were always, grievances. We attack you because you attack us, etc. Whereas the Arabic text that I read and translated was the exact opposite. It just said, it sounded like the Islamic State dash. We have to kill them because they're infidels, kuffar, etc. So I put that together, and since then I've just really been involved in this field, especially, again, that nexus, that connection between Islam and the West. So one of the other...
Okay, if I could just ask you about, I'd like to ask you a few questions about, first of all, about that book. That first one, we did not show a picture of it, but it's a fascinating title. It's called The Al-Qaeda Reader, and it's about where you actually took the Arabic writings of Al-Qaeda and translated them into English. And and what's interesting to me is that I read a little bit about your own professional experience with CNN. You had been on CNN and these different networks and stuff. One thing I'm interested in is first of all, do you think that the West understands? Do you think that the West understands or is willing to understand the real motives behind a lot of what is happening from the jihadi world, from jihadi militant groups and stuff like that? Is the West willing to understand? Because I know, one thing I've done several programs about, and I used to be a reporter myself. I used to be a journalist. I studied journalism. I graduated with a degree in journalism. And I know there's this politically correct fear of Islamophobia. Is the West receptive to hearing the things that you've written, especially like if we could start with like that of the Al-Qaeda Reader?
Well, to answer that question truthfully, one has to dissect it, and you come to find out that the word West, we all anthropomorphize it and turn it into a person, but the West just means millions, if not billions, of people.
Right.
So in that context, of course, some are receptive, some are not. I agree with you that the narrative, the mainstream narrative that is upheld by the powers that be in academia and politics and media is such, as you said, they fear the whole Islamophobia thing. and they try to whitewash the history, the doctrine of Islam, and so forth. So certainly that's going on. But I do believe that a lot of the average people in the West who don't have much of a voice are seeing things a lot more clearly nowadays, and they are receptive to my message and others.
Okay.
I think, yeah.
Have you been able to get into universities to talk to students?
I have. I've been invited to universities. I've been invited to testify before Congress about Islam-related themes. So yeah, there's some receptivity, but then there's also some who don't want to hear, and some who will. One college I went to after I went there, and to give you an example. So this is actually a perfect example. It was a college in Washington State, Everett College, and I went there. And when I was there, it was packed. It was full. There were people standing, people sitting on the floor. And it was, from my vantage point, very receptive. I got a standing ovation and so forth, okay? But then it was also covered in the media. And the media showed you two people. One was a Muslima in a burqa, and another was clearly a Muslim man with a Salafi beard. They were the only two people they interviewed. Both of them complained, naturally. They didn't show you how many people were in attendance or clapping or happy to be there. And so the message for anyone who didn't go there but just watched it on the news is what a horrible event this was, and everyone didn't like it, and Muslims were upset by it. But, of course, the reality is different. So I think that's the perfect analogy to understand what's going on. There's the reality, and there is a lot of people whose eyes are being opened, but then there's the powers that be who are doing everything they can to cover it up.
That's kind of my, that's kind of my, the bone I have to pick with the media and with what I see, the whole system, that I've seen is that there seems to be this effort to either demonize anyone who will speak about Islam, and try to expose Islam, and then, this whitewashing of Islam, for instance. If I could just ask you one question really quickly before I really want to get into your new book that's going to come out tomorrow. I'm very interested in it, and I'm very interested in the way that you are, one thing that I read that it was very interesting to me is that rather than just focusing on what the Islamic texts say, the theory, the Quran says this, the Hadith says this, the Sunnah says this, you are actually showing these are the actual actions that they carried out because of the Quran, because of the Hadith, and that these are actual historic events that took place and that are taking place even now, that the West is just oblivious to, or they've been giving some whitewashed version of this history, if they even know about them. But you know what? Since I just went ahead and did that, let me just go ahead. I'm just going to go ahead and start asking you about these particular battles. If you could just explain to me, I know that this has been something that you've written about before. You wrote about what's called the Battle of Yarmouk. The Battle of Yarmouk. And I know you wrote another book about it because I saw it on the internet. But can you tell me why did you write about that battle in this book? And what is the importance of this battle to what is happening in the world today?
Sure, Hussein. But first I'd like to comment on something you said in agreement.
Okay.
Which is that I explained in my book in the preface that one of the problems that we have today in trying to open people's eyes to the Islamic question is that so many people are showing the doctrine of Islam, the Hadith, the Quran, the Seerah of the Prophet and so forth. And that's easy to do because those are very finite collected texts and you can just go through them all and show them. But what very, very few people have done is to show you what Muslims have done in and to the West and other, non-Muslim countries from a historical point of view.
Right.
So, because oftentimes what you get is a lot of people will tell you, well, so what the Quran says that, so what the Hadith said that. This is an old text written, 100 years ago. Or it's theory, and well, what about the Bible? The Bible has violence. And so you get into these sort of endless arguments. So I wanted to just document the actual facts of what has happened. So now, with that caveat, let me go to the Yarmouk battle that you asked about. The Battle of Yarmouk, so the book is laid out. I have 8 chapters, and each chapter centers around what I've basically determined is the most important battles between Islam and the West, 8 of them. And as it happens, 4 of them, the West wins and 4 Muslims win. But the first one is the Battle of Yarmouk, and in many ways I think that's actually the most important battle. And the Yarmouk is a river in Syria, and it happened in 636 AD, just 4 years after Muhammad died, according to traditional accounts. And what's very important about it is, most people don't know this, especially people in the West. They don't know that a country like Syria or Egypt or all of North Africa, today we think of them as Islamic nations, but they were actually more Christian than any European country. In Syria and Egypt were more Christian than Spain and Rome, and maybe Greece was just as much, and Anatolia or Asia Minor.
Okay, I just want to, because that's something, and maybe the Middle Eastern Christians know this, but I've never known that. We're so used to the way things are right now. We think of Christian Europe and the Muslim Middle East, but just what you're saying right now is that the Middle East was more Christian back then than Europe was at that time.
Right.
And so that's something that just for the Western mind, that I didn't know that, so that's a fascinating point. So anyway, sorry to interrupt you, but that I just wanted to kind of make that point.
Well, that's fine, and since it fascinates you, I'll elaborate some more. When you think about the centers of Christianity, there were 5, in the ancient world, and or they're known as the sees, okay, and one of them was in Rome, but the other 4 were in the east, and so one was in Constantinople, one was in Alexandria in Egypt, one was in Antioch, and the other one was in Jerusalem. And of course, those 4 are right now under Islamic control.
Under Islam.
So that gives you an idea. So you can arguably say 80% of the Christian world was conquered by Islam. And in fact, a lot of Western historians have determined, looking at maps, including myself, that if you took the entire Christian world in the 7th century when Islam went on the jihad, the Great Arab Conquest, as they're called, when it was all said and done, Islam had permanently conquered 3/4 of the original Christian world. And so when you talk about the concept of Europe, okay, I think a lot of people think Europe was always that little, appendage, that northwest appendage of Eurasian landmass, but that's not how the ancients saw it. In the post-Roman world, the Christian world, was North Africa, the Middle East, and mostly Southern Europe, minus Scandinavia and these regions. That was a civilizational block. And so the idea that Europe is just Europe, that wouldn't have made sense, because Spaniards and people in Sicily and Italy and Greece were much more culturally connected to people in Egypt and Syria and Morocco than they were, let's say, to Norway or Scandinavia or Russia, of course. None of those were even Christian at the point. And so what Islam did is it completely cut off the continuity of the post-Roman Christian world. And really what Europe was the final bastion of Christendom that was continuously bombarded both from west and east and in the Mediterranean by Muslims for centuries. And that's really what gave it its identity. So it was the last area where Christianity still was able to reign, and Islam did not snuff out. Okay.
Could I ask you just one thing about the? Because you're blowing my mind with all this information, man. Stuff I never thought about or knew. You're not taught this stuff in history books. But about those.
I know, especially in the Middle East. In the Middle East, it sounds like there was no Christianity. Egypt, it goes from the pharaohs and it jumps to Islam, and it's the half. The openings, and the Copts, they don't even have a history apparently, even though there was 1,000 years of Greco-Roman Coptic history between the pharaohs and Islam.
One thing you said about the 5 C's, there was Alexandria, Jerusalem, Antioch, and Constantinople, and Rome. And, that 4 of them were conquered by Islam, but one of them was not, which is Rome. And I was thinking about the way ISIS, a couple years back when they were in Libya, I remember the guy holding up the knife and his sword and aiming it at Rome and saying, "We're coming for you, Rome." I'm wondering, do you think in their mindset that that was like the last bastion that they did not conquer, that they are looking to take over all 5 of those seas?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, first of all, there's hadith first of all, Muhammad supposedly prophesied about the conquest of Constantinople. And there's another hadith that says we will iftah or open, conquer Rome after we conquer Constantinople.
Okay.
And, and here's another tidbit you probably and most people don't know, but Muslims attacked and plundered Rome in 846. Arabs and Muslims came from North Africa and the islands around Spain, which was, of course, under Islamic control at that point, and they invaded Rome and they sacked both of Christendom's most important basilicas, that of St. Peter and that of St. Paul, and they desecrated their tombs and stole and plundered. So that happened in 846, and it was done in an Islamic jihadi context.
Wow.
And few people, again, know that. The walls that you have right now around the Vatican were built in response to these Islamic attacks. And I find it, ironic that now you get someone like Pope Francis talking about break the walls down. And he's living in a place that has walls that were built originally to defend against Muslims.
If we could get back to because I'm not sure if we're going to even be able to get through all of these battles, but I'd like to go back to the most important point that you obviously put this together and you chose these battles for a specific reason. And, if you could just continue and to tell us what was so important about, or the main point you wanted to tell us about the Battle of Yarmouk. I'd like to make sure we get that point.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea to just go through the battles and explain why I think they're the most important.
Okay.
Anyone who's interested in, there's a lot of, I quote from a lot of primary source material. I translated from things that I don't think I've ever even been translated from in Arabic and Greek and some Latin texts. And so the accounts are immensely colorful. It's amazing to me because, you've heard of the saying, truth is stranger than fiction. Yeah. Well, in the case of these battles, they are more dramatic and more glorious than any movie I've ever seen. And so any one of them could be a blockbuster Hollywood hit. And they wouldn't even have to exaggerate. Just follow the actual narrative of the battle. Mm-hmm. So definitely the actual battles are so interesting and something to read. And whoever can just, look at it in the book. But I'll explain to you the significance of each battle. So Yarmouk, 636, this is the first major and massive defeat the Muslims or the Arabs gave to the Roman Empire, or known as the Byzantine Empire, along the Yarmouk River. They completely annihilated the army. And why it's important is because after that, there was no more resistance. And then, like dominoes, all of these formerly, all these countries that were part of the Roman Empire, including Syria and Egypt and all the North African coastline, from Libya to Morocco, giving them their modern names, were in decades conquered. Egypt was conquered about 4 or 5 years right after Yarmouk. And then this sort of thing continued all throughout the 7th century until all of North Africa, until Morocco, was under Islamic control permanently. And like I said, it's not just important because of that massive domino-like conquest, but it's also important in how it completely changed the face of history. Because think of what would have happened. Historians often ask, what if? What if Islam didn't conquer Egypt and Syria and North Africa and Anatolia or modern-day Turkey, and those were part of Western civilization? I can give you one thing that happened. The Dark Ages wouldn't have happened in Europe, because right when they cut off, once Egypt was conquered, the papyrus supply was cut off instantly from Europe, and in one generation they all went illiterate. And that's just one example. Okay.
Wow.
So then, the next two battles. So that's chapter 1. The next two battles, chapter 2 and 3, are essentially where the extent of Islam managed to go against the West. And so went into Spain.
I'll just say that this is the siege of Constantinople, the Wall of Stone.
The second siege, right, the second siege of Constantinople in 717, and also a few years later in 713, the Battle of Tours. And they're at the other end. So Islam managed to go in to Spain, the furthest westernmost region of Europe, and they conquered Spain. And they weren't stopped until in 732 by Charles Martel, the French, the ancestors of the French, at the Battle of Tours. And that was another very significant battle, because after that battle, Islam then gets confined south of the Pyrenees Mountains, that separate Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, from mainland Europe, and they just stayed in Spain. And then in Constantinople, that was always the number one prize that Muslims wanted to get. Okay, and they tried several times. There were the first siege, which was like 5 years long in the 670s, and that failed. And then another much bigger siege came in 717, and that also failed. And so what those two battles did in conjunction, that's why I sort of have them connected, is they demarked the limitations of Islam's frontier with the Christian world, okay? Because one stopped at France, and now they're left over in Spain, and one kept them out of Europe proper from the east, and now they were just stuck on the eastern side of Anatolia, okay? So then in chapter 4, I have what's called the Battle of Manzikert, and that's a very important battle, speaking of Constantinople, because that's the one battle that Anatolia, or Asia Minor, what today is called Turkey, was all Greek-speaking, and was all Christian. And in fact, that's where most of the churches that St. Paul wrote epistles to.
Right.
How Christian that region was. Okay, and after the Battle of Manzikert, so now the new standard bearers of Islam and practitioners of jihad are Turks, specifically the Seljuk Turks at this point, in the 1050s and so forth. And they start waging jihad. In the book, I have so much, this was even surprising to me, the extent of it, but the amount of atrocities committed in just Armenia, okay, in the 11th century. Usually when people talk about Turks and Armenians, they say genocide 20th century.
1917.
A little earlier. Yeah, but what was happening 1,000 years is possibly worse. Literally hundreds of thousands of Armenians were being slaughtered, thousands of churches set on fire, crosses being destroyed, the sorts of things that we're used to from ISIS, okay, but on a much larger scale. And this went on until finally the Roman Emperor, the Eastern Roman Emperor, Romanus Diogenes, comes out and has a massive battle with the Seljuk Turks. No, he's known as Alp Arslan. His real name, of course, is Muhammad. And they have a big battle, and the Turks win. And after that, that's the beginning of the Islamification of Turkey, which, like I said, was very Christian at that point. And they continue spreading, and before you know it, they're now facing Constantinople. The whole of Turkey has been taken over, hundreds of thousands of Christians killed or enslaved, and it comes out very clearly in the sources. And what else is important about this particular battle of Manzikert, which was waged in 1071, is this is the missing background to the Crusades. When you talk about the Crusades, which start in 1095, it's always, here in the West especially, presented in a vacuum. All of a sudden, things were fine between Muslims and Christians, and then some pope decided, let's ruin this good thing, and he was an imperialistic, evil Catholic pope, and all these greedy knights, they wanted to go colonize the Middle East.
Right.
Maybe get oil, even though oil wasn't working then, so I don't know. And he called the Crusades.
Solomon's Temple, yeah.
Yeah, in fact, the Crusades came 100% because of this last battle I talked about and what was happening in Asia Minor.
Okay.
And mass slaughter, and that comes out in the text.
I'd like to just stop once, just for a second on this, because this is something that is, quite often when Christians, even today, they come to the Middle East. One thing that quite a few of them do, and I think they will continue to do it, is that they're very apologetic about the Crusades. It's just like, with all Christian history and everything that Christians have done, there's this one point where they have to apologize, especially like when I'm Palestinian, when they come to the Holy Land, that there's kind of like, yeah, this was a real big mistake that we made, and we're very sorry about this. And there was even this thing called the Crusader Walk, prayer walk, where they walked along the place where the Crusaders had come, and just repenting for what the Crusaders had done to the Muslims. Yeah. But I find it interesting, and I got to tell you, if we look in our history books, if we look, if I were to go right now and get an American high school or junior high school history book that talks about the Crusaders, it's going to be these wicked Crusaders against these innocent Muslims who were just there in Jerusalem, and then all this, and it's always got this narrative, and it's been there for so long. But just what you're saying right now about that, it's not just about Jerusalem, but there was a lot of other things that were going on at this time that actually sparked the initial Crusader movement, and it wasn't you know, like one thing I always hear about is the Knights of the Templar. You know, that they went there to get the treasures of the Temple of Solomon. You know, and it was this these greedy Europeans. You know, which fits into the narrative of the imperialistic Europe. And so, anyway, I just wanted to point that out because I mean, you're giving us a lot of information there, but there's some very important jewels and nuggets in what you are saying right now. And if I could just stop you two for just 1 second, and I would like to ask you, is there a particular message, for instance, from the Battle of Yarmouk, that you think is important for people to understand in light of what's happening today? Oh, okay.
Yeah. Well,
I just want to tell our viewers that our Skype was temporarily disconnected. We're going to get that set up again, but we still have Brother Ibrahim on the telephone. So
yeah, and I heard your question fine, so I can answer. So yeah, the main takeaway from Yarmouk, aside of course from the other things that I pointed out, you know, the historical ramifications and demarcation and split of, you know, the Christian world, is I'm almost certain virtually nobody except ISIS knows that when they get up and they say, as they have to the West, that your blood tastes the best and we have come to drink it, or we will take your Rome and break your crosses, or we love death as much as you love life. Nobody knows that all these words were spoken at Yarmouk verbatim by Khalid bin al-Walid, Saif Allah, sort of Allah, and others. They are chosen literally and being copied by men like ISIS, who want to put themselves in the footsteps of the original conquerors of Syria. You know, these early Arabs, Khalid bin al-Walid and others. That's exactly what they said in these early Islamic texts, and I translated much of it because I haven't seen it in English translations from al-Waqidi, you know, the early Islamic who wrote the Futuh of Syria and Shem and so forth. So I think, you know, no one understands the continuity of how these people's mind works. They saw what happened, and they understand what history says, and they want to emulate it, literally, verbatim. Okay. And yet we're told that ISIS, you know, they have nothing to do with Islam, they're just criminals. And yet here they are using even the same exact formulaic expressions and words that the original jihadists used.
Yeah. If I could, I'm sorry, I mean, this isn't the direction that I was planning to go on, but like I said, you're telling me things here that are just, you know, it's like blowing my mind here. One thing is just that you're talking about Yarmouk. The thing about it is that you're talking about Syria. And right now, Syria is the #1 hotspot in the world, and it has been the absolute center of what is going on with ISIS, with you know, all of these other terrorist groups, even Al-Qaeda and everything. Is there that connection that you see between Syria of the way back then and of today? And if you could just give me 1 second, we have one caller on the line, but then I want to get back to that question. We have Andy on the line. Hello, Andy.
Yeah, I have a question. It seems that the Muslims are doing an excellent job in putting America to sleep, to not understand what their ultimate goal is, what their domination and kind of elimination of all people that don't embrace their philosophy. Is there something we can do? I don't know. To wake the people up.
Yes.
I mean, all you need is read the Quran, and it's clearly understood what's going on, but the people are blind.
Wow. Did you hear him?
I did not.
Okay, let me just tell you what says. There's a caller, Andy. He's a frequent caller on our program here, and he says, you know, it seems like Islam is has put England to sleep, and it's putting America to sleep, and it's like people are just not aware of what's going on and what the true intentions of Islam is, and what can be done to wake the people up?
Well, I do agree to an extent that, there are Islamic types and organizations who are engaged in, this sort of propaganda that makes Western countries fall asleep. But ultimately, I really lay the blame on the West itself, because they are the ones who are putting themselves to sleep intentionally. I mean, even if you say it's the media, or if it's this particular, mouthpiece or that mouthpiece, Western countries are supposed to be a democracy. They're supposed to have representatives to represent them and so forth, and make laws and rules to govern them. And they've gone asleep because they don't really ultimately care. You look at some of these, America is nowhere near as bad as some of these European countries like Sweden, for instance, and Germany. And, it's not what's happening there. And I think this is what's important. And this is a very important point I often make, even in connection to my book, which is, whereas Muslims invaded Europe and the Middle East and conquered by force, that was one thing. And the people, the Christians who lived in those nations, fought them back, and they understood them. And now you have really, the Islamic world is weak. Militarily, economically, it's weak. So why are they doing what they're doing to Europe and the West? And then you find out it's not because of Muslims themselves. It's because of Westerners and the policies that they create, and the opportunities that they give to migrants to come and wreak havoc, and then you can't talk about it, and you got to be politically correct, and then it gets worse, and they whitewash. So all of these forces that we've discussed before are what I think really putting Americans and Westerners in general to sleep, and it's homegrown. I do think, again, there's Islamic elements involved, but I think they're very minor compared to what the West is doing to itself.
Wow, yeah. That one thing that I think about too, because I often think about it in the spiritual dimension, that, the church is asleep. The church is, are we preaching the gospel? Are we reaching out to these Muslims? Are we telling them about Jesus? I was at a church service last night with Brother David Wood, and before, he was saying that, we weren't able to minister, to go reach out to the Muslims before, because it was so dangerous to go to Saudi Arabia. It was so dangerous to go to Syria. It was so dangerous to go to some of these countries. But now those countries have come to the West. They are here, and, are we as a church reaching out to them? Are we trying to preach the gospel to them? Are we preaching the gospel at all? And I kind of see it as a failure of the church to fulfill its ministry, to fulfill the Great Commission, to preach the gospel to the Muslims. That's just one way that I look at it. So,
I agree with you with all that, but there's another side to Christian theology that I'd like to also discuss, which is, to me, I call it Western Christianity. And what I mean by Western Christianity, of course, in its origin, it's Protestant. But I think even Catholics, and maybe to a lesser extent Orthodox, suffer from the same thing. But Western Christianity has been essentially turned into a doormat. And it's only half of Christ's teaching is being presented, which is the forgiveness and the tolerance and the so forth. But you know what? If you look at the Bible, if you look at historic churches and teachings, that's not what it was. There was another side to it. The same Christ who said, turn the other cheek, when he got slapped, he actually questioned the person who slapped him, why he did it. He challenged him. Paul called for his legal rights. When a Roman centurion came to Jesus and asked him for a favor, he never once told him, well, quit your job, even though Rome was the most violent war machine around. John the Baptist didn't tell Roman soldiers to quit their job. And so this idea that to be a Christian, you need to be a doormat and you can't stand up for yourself. Yes. Christ went into the temple and he didn't, turn the other cheek when he saw what was happening. He took a whip and he beat people and he threw them out. So this little, this more muscular, masculine version of Christianity, I think, has been completely stripped out of Western Christianity, and it's just needed for balance. I'm not talking about aggressive warfare or conquest. I'm talking about self-defense. Right. And going back to the Crusades, that's exactly what the Crusades were. They were understood as Christian theology does permit and support defending yourself and defending your civilization. And that's exactly how it was seen. But today, when you see these Christians walking from Germany to the Middle East wearing a shirt in Arabic that says, I'm sorry for the Crusades and all that, they just simply don't get it. And they don't get it because they're following a sort of half watered-down doormat Christianity. And that's why they're very much lost when it comes to these questions.
You know, that this was a couple of years ago, and I was here. You know, I was doing my program at that time, and I mentioned it on my program at the time. It was when the Muslim Brotherhood had gone on this rampage in Egypt, and they had blown up churches and killed Christians. I think there was one particular church where they killed. It was like a Christmas Eve service or something, and there was, you know, just a large number of people were killed. 27 people or something like that were killed in this church, and I read something that just blew my mind when I read it, and I knew that it was biblical, but I had never thought about it before. And this was from one of the Christians in Egypt said this. They said, "I have the right to ask you, why did you hit me?" You know, because when Jesus was hit by the soldier, he said to him, "Why did you hit me?" And it's like, I don't have the right as a Christian to punch you back, but I do have the right to ask you, why did you hit me? You know, and when I read that, I thought, wow, I think that's such something you don't hear about in Christianity anymore. Is that, and I heard another guy say something too. He says that Jesus told us that if somebody asked you to walk a mile with him, walk with him 2. But Jesus did not say walk with him 3. He said walk 2, which is to go beyond what is requested. But he did not say 3. I mean, it's not like a giving up of your own person, your own identity, your own rights. Right. So
there's limitations, and those limitations, I think, are very obvious when you have someone that come in your nation and putting a sword to your throat and saying, you know, renounce Christ. I think you are very much, you have the right to defend yourself.
Yes. You know, thank you very much, Brother Andy, for your question, and it's, you know, I think it's a question that so many people are asking, you know, is, you know, what is the West, you know, what are we supposed to do? But I think that what you're doing, you know, in putting out this book and the fact that you have, you know, had such a great spirit of excellence in what you've done, to where you've been able to work and to communicate with the Congress and with the media at large and universities, you know, thank God for what you're doing. I believe that's such an important a responsibility that we have, but not everybody can do that. And you know, one thing I've always felt is that it's going to take the Arabs who've come to the West to defend the West, because the West doesn't know what's going on. And it takes some of the Arabs who've lived there or who've come from there, who understand the truth of what happened there, to be able to communicate to them and to help educate them about the realities of Islam, the realities of what they teach. And so, you know, I really appreciate what you have done. And if we could just go, because I don't know if we're going to have enough time to finish all of these battles, but I'd like to get back to your,
Sure.
Let's see, we were at the Cristendom Strikes Back. If you could tell us about the Battle of Hattin, I guess it's called, yeah?
Yeah, well, the Battle of Hattin is probably the most important of all the Crusade battles, because it's when Saladin defeats the Christians, and then they lose Jerusalem to him, and they never really gain it back after that. And in less than a century, or right about a century, then the final Crusader presence is completely thrown out. So it basically kind of goes downhill after the Battle of Hattin, especially when it comes to the question of Jerusalem. But, you know, Hattin is also important for the figure of Saladin, Saladin, because it's amazing to see how much has been written about him in the West for centuries, about what a wonderful,
how glorious,
he's a chivalrous knight, you know.
Yeah.
He's noble and he's honorable, and, you know, the Christians are all these cynical, evil hypocrites and so forth. And yet, when you delve into the actual sources, what you get is basically an ISIS leader. There's accounts of him crucifying Copts in Egypt, where he reigned. That was his headquarters in Egypt. He made an order that any church needs to have mud and dirt thrown on it, and all the crosses broken down. Okay, that's just one example. And then when you look at his biographies, apparently the most thing that he was interested in doing was jihad. And after, lest you think Saladin was just about defending, he said his dying wish was, after all these crusaders are gone, then I want to enter Europe until not one person is left alive who does not say La ilaha illallah. Ahmedabad and so forth.
Right.
That's hand. There probably isn't enough time to finish all the next 4 battles, but I can give you a quick summary.
Yes.
The sixth chapter deals with what I think is one of the most important epics of Christendom versus Islam, and it's one of the least known. And it's basically Spain. Spain was a microcosm. It was its own contained little world of jihad and crusade for about 700 years.
Wow.
Because the Muslims entered it in the year 711. They conquered it, just like they conquered North Africa and Egypt and Syria and so forth, and they stayed there for centuries. Now, as usual, and as with the Crusades, historians have cherry-picked, and they found like 3 decades in those 700-800 years where the Cordoban Caliphate was supposedly very glorious, and it was so it was prosperous and educated and et cetera, et cetera. Okay.
Obama.
Well, aside from the fact that that's not even true, because at the height of the golden era of this Cordoban Caliphate, Christians were being mutilated, skinned alive, burned because they blasphemed or because they were somehow seduced into converting to Islam and wanted to return to Christianity. So even in that peak, it was ISIS, basically, okay? But they won't talk about that, historians. But then the other 90% of that history was continuous warfare, Muslims and Christians, Muslims trying to conquer the rest of Christendom, the rest of the Christians of Spain, who were by now in the very small foothills in the northernmost area of Spain, of the Iberian Peninsula. That's where they were limited. And over the centuries, they continued growing and spreading down south and fighting the Muslims and eventually defeating them until 1492, when they all actually got thrown out. And there's a very interesting section, and I have it in the book, about Takeya. We all know about Takeya.
Yes.
And we've all heard about how bad the Inquisition was in Spain. Okay, but what you don't know is when you look at the sources, what was going on is Spain had finally concluded that Muslims either leave or become Christian, and the reason wasn't because we want them to be good Christians because we're fanatical Christians. It was because as long as they're Muslim, they're going to be trying to undermine Spain because it was a Christian nation, and they were. And so that decree came out. And instantly after it, another fatwa came out saying every Muslim can pretend to convert, do communion, get baptized, go to church, but be a Muslim in his heart. And they all did that. About 500,000 Muslims were doing that. And whenever there was an opportunity, there's records of Christians saying they used to come to church and do baptism and confession and the Eucharist and bring their children and so forth. But at home they were excellent Muslims who talked about nothing but jihad. Okay,
wow.
And so that is the origins of the Inquisition.
Wow.
An effort for the Spanish crown to try to find out amongst these Muslims who really was a Christian and who wasn't, because who wasn't was actively working to undermine it. And in the end, they just gave up and they evicted them all because you couldn't tell.
Wow.
But it was 100% based on Takeya. And here's another example of how, we hear about the Inquisition, but it's in a vacuum, just like the Crusades are presented in a vacuum.
Yes.
Not understanding what Muslims are doing to bring about such extreme responses.
Right. Wow.
Yeah.
Then
there's, I don't think we have time, but the next few chapters are probably the most interesting and they're the longest because they start entering closer to our era and there's a lot more sources, so there's a lot more details. But they deal with everything from the Ottoman Empire's advances into Europe, from Russia's experiences under Islam, which never makes it into any book about the West of Islam. Somehow Russia gets thrown out. But they suffered the same exact thing for centuries, and even worse, especially the Slavic peoples in general. And then there was the non-stop pirate raids, where you got like 5 to 6 million Christians were actually abducted and sold in the slave markets of Algeria and the Crimean Khanate, the Tatars, in the east. 5-6 million in just 2 or 3 centuries.
Wow.
And then, and it goes up until America's first war. The United States of America had its first war right after it proclaimed independence from England, but before it had elected its first president, George Washington. That's how early it was. And it was against Muslims. And these Muslims were invading American ships, enslaving all their crews.
The Barbary, is that the Barbary coast?
The Barbary, right, the Barbary Wars.
You see, we've heard about that. It's in our songs in America, from the Barbary coast to the, and yet nobody understands. We just think it's these pirates, with the parrot on his shoulder and eye patch.
Yeah, exactly.
nobody knows, you know, the true history of that. Wow. You know, the
part,
you know, the just the,
go ahead.
go, you know, I just wanted to say that these things that you're saying are just, it's like it's just you're opening our eyes here to the reality of this history, the lies that, you know, because I've heard often said, you know, the most powerful people are the historians because they get to tell us what they want us to believe, you know, and it's just like we've been sold this bill of goods, you know, and it's not necessarily that what they're saying isn't true, didn't happen. It's just that they're not telling us the whole story. They didn't tell us exactly what happened, you know. I mean, all this stuff you're talking about, the Inquisition, about the Crusades, about the Christian Middle East, all of this stuff. I mean, you're blowing my mind here with all this stuff that, you know, I went to school, I went to university, I'm a university graduate, I didn't know none of this stuff.
Actually, the more educated you get, the less you're going to know because they indoctrinate people with lies. But back to what you were saying, you're right about the power historians have, and they can manipulate it. And it's in that context, I'm very proud. I want to read to you one of the blurbs, the book on the back, one of the blurbs from a professor, a Crusades historian and a college professor. Here's what he said about my book. He says, Raymond Ibrahim has the humility to take seriously the voices and opinions of history's Christians and Muslims. The result is a refreshingly honest account of Islamic expansion and Christian reaction that provides useful insights into today's problem. This is history as it should be done, allowing the past to inform and guide the present instead of distorting the past to fit it into contemporary political ideology. This is exactly what most historians have been doing when it comes to the history of Islam in the West. They've been twisting it around, the Crusades and the Inquisition, in an effort to demonize Christians and to exonerate and make Muslims look like victims.
Wow. Wow, that's a great, you know, I wanted to read you something else that I actually got from your book because I read part of it. And, you know, one thing that you said in the book is that, you know, at first, you know, I could just kind of summarize it, is that, you know, that Islam came and it attacked Christendom. Christendom fought back, and eventually Christendom fought back Islam to where it was this weakened force. I mean, it had this glorious few years, but it was so devastated, and it was reduced to, you know, the weak condition of the Muslim world today. As you know, the whole Arabian Peninsula with all the oil that they have, you know, with all the billions of dollars they get, and yet their GDP is less than Spain, you know, one European country. You know, it shows the weakness of the Islamic philosophy and how it doesn't work politically or economically. But one thing that you said is that through this history, Islam hasn't changed. Even though Islam was defeated, Islam did not change. They retained their jihadi worldview and their expansionist worldview, but Christendom has changed. And they've become more tolerant, more welcoming, and they have essentially, you know, just kind of laid down and allowed, you know, this becoming, and I sense there was a word that you used, you know, an accomplice almost to jihad, you know, with their apathy.
Right, they facilitate the jihad.
Facilitate jihad, yes. You know, brother Raymond, it's been just an amazing, seriously, I've learned so much today. I so appreciate this book, and I'm definitely going to buy it. You know, I've read parts of it already, you know, the parts I could read for free on the internet, but I'm definitely going to buy it when it comes out tomorrow. Could we put up the picture of the book again, please? It's the scimitar and the sword and the scimitar.
Are you talking to me or?
Yeah,
here it is.
I'm talking to the control room. See if they could.
Okay.
Could you guys put up the picture of the book? Yeah, this is the book, and this book will be. Where can people get this book, Raymond?
They can get it at Amazon. I think Barnes and Noble is carrying it. Maybe Walmart. A lot of places are actually carrying it. It's already being translated into a couple of other languages.
Phenomenal.
It has a lot of pictures, you know, and just since we were talking about it, you know, here, I don't know if you can see, but here's the Barbary Wars, you know,
yeah.
Muslims and Americans fighting. And I didn't finish the final part, which is when Thomas Jefferson met the Barbary ambassador. He said, "Why are you doing this?"
Yes.
The Barbary ambassador said, "Our Quran tells us infidels are our slaves. We have to fight them and kill them." And so it's the lesson of the book, for anyone who wants to know, and the documented lesson, is that ISIS is a mirror reflection of what Islamic history has been all about. except it was much even more in quality and quantity, the jihad throughout history. But everything that we're told is not Islamic, well, that's not true. In this book, I've got over 1,000 footnotes documenting otherwise.
Wow. Well, I think we're going to have you on the program again in the future to continue this. It's just been seriously such a wonderful opportunity to have you on the program. And I so appreciate the articles you've written about Father Zechariah, just explaining to the West, his phenomenal teachings, and then that you're going this next step, which is just has been so educational for me, and so and I thank you so much for being with us today. And like I said, I wish you much success with the book, and I'm definitely going to buy it on Amazon as soon as it's available. And
okay, thank you, Hussein. I appreciate it very much.
Yes, God bless you, and
good being with you, and God bless.
God bless you too, brother, and thank you. And to all our viewers, we just end this program just by telling you, it's like been a mind-boggling experience listening to this. And but the most important thing is that we always return to our teacher, to the Lord Jesus Christ, and say, Lord Jesus, open our eyes more and more to know the truth about you and about everything, Lord God. Open our eyes to know you. That's the most important thing. God loves you. Jesus loves you. He died for you. He rose again after 3 days to give you life. And I thank you for being with us today. And I hope that you will be with us again in a future episode of the program, Message of Grace.